Good afternoon. I'm Robert Pondiscio, a senior fellow in education policy here at the American Enterprise Institute. Delighted to welcome you here today for a conversation on what President Biden's proposed budget cuts mean for charter schools. But there's a larger conversation to be had today. The charter school sector is at an interesting moment in its evolution right now. For years, charter schools have been a disruptive force in American education. And now, arguably, they are themselves being disrupted with the rise of, in more than a dozen states, of education spending accounts or ESAs. And this has made charter school politics somewhat complicated. For years, the Ed Reform bipartisan coalition more or less embraced charter schools. On the right, charters were a bulwark against the K-12 education blob and teachers' unions. On the left, they were a means of improving outcomes for low-income kids of color. Well, so much for all that. Republicans have fallen in love with ESAs. Democrats have rekindled their romance with traditional public schools and teachers' unions. So where does that leave charter schools, which are still quite popular with parents, if not with politicians? The ostensible reason that we're gathered here today is to talk about charter schools and the federal government. The Biden administration is proposing to cut $40 million from the federal budget in the 2025 fiscal year as the federal government's only funding source for creating new charter schools and replicating successful charter models. But the larger backdrop for today's conversation is to unpack charter schools' role in today's American K-12 ecosystem, which is changing, I think it's fair to say, far more rapidly and dramatically than anyone might have expected or predicted just a few short years ago. So let's meet our panelists. Helen Baxendale, to my extreme right, is the Chief of Staff and Vice President of Strategy and Analytics at Great Hearts Academies. That's a network of classical charter schools serving 28,000 students across Arizona, Texas, and Louisiana. Helen's K-12 career began as a high school English, history, and civics teacher with the Teach for Australia program. She also worked for several years as a policy advisor to the Leader of the Opposition and Minister for Education in the Australian Parliament, and as a contract consultant to various public sector agencies, NGOs, multinationals, and philanthropic entities in Australia, England, and here in the United States. Helen has a PhD and a master's degree in public policy from the University of Oxford, which she attended as a Rhodes Scholar, and a bachelor's degree in political science and history from the Australian National University. To my immediate right is Christy Wolfe. She is the Senior Vice President for Policy, Research, and Planning for the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. She has more than 20 years of experience working on federal education policy and has been a strong advocate of charter schools ever since her first visit to a charter school in 1998 for a U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and the Workforce field hearing. Christy spent 8 years at the U.S. Department of Education, where she served as the Associate Deputy Secretary for Policy. In that role, she managed policy development and implemented regulations for all federal elementary, secondary, and special education programs. Christy was also a professional staff member for the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Education and the Workforce, where she worked on major education legislation, including No Child Left Behind, the NCLB, or No Child Left Behind Act. And in between those two is Derrell Bradford.
Please don't read my bio.
He is the president of 50 CAN. We'll keep it short, the 50 State Campaign for Achievement Now. In that role, Derrell leads 50 CAN's Spark work and trains and recruits local leaders across the country to serve as executive directors of state CAN's advocacy fellows and citizen advocates. So with that, let's just jump right in. We'll keep it brief for Derrell. Actually, let's start with Christy, just so we can kind of define terms. Why did Biden go after the charter schools program? And could you explain a little bit about what the program is?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So the charter schools program, we also call it the CSP program, so if I slip into jargon, that's what I'm talking about, is a program that was brought about in the mid-90s to provide funding, startup funding for charter schools to open. We found early on in the movement that districts and states didn't have an incentive to provide startup funds to cover the cost of starting a school. So it was considered a significant federal role to step in and provide that startup funding. So the funding goes to a school developer to cover costs until they have students. Once you have students in your building, you're going to get the per pupil allocations. So the program's funded at about $440 million right now. It's been that since FY 2019. It received a significant bump at the end of the Obama administration, sort of the fruits of a lot of bipartisan working together. So the program has been instrumental in the expansion of charter schools around the country. It's responsible for about half of the charter schools that are open today have gotten some kind of funding. It also provides funding for facilities and covering those costs. So it plays this helpful role to charters that are already open if they are trying to access a building. So why did the Biden administration propose cutting? Well, that's a good question. I mean, the important thing to remember about a presidential budget, if you don't live this every day, is that it's thematic, it's a policy document, and often, and most often, is dead on arrival in Congress because they're the ones that actually make the spending decisions. So why did the Biden administration go out of their way to kind of stick it to the charter schools program with a cut that was not going to save them any significant amount of money to enact their other policy priorities? Now, they want to say that they're not actually changing their position or support for charter schools. They still love high-quality charter schools. They want to point to the fact that charter schools are slowing in their growth. And where we think they're wrong, if you want me to go on to why we think they're wrong, is that the charter schools are actually continuing to grow. They've grown 300,000 students over the last 5 years, while district schools are losing population. So really, one of the things that we've seen since the Biden administration came into office is a desire to layer on more regulations to the program and make it harder to actually get the money and spend the money. And that's what we're seeing. So to the extent that there are any slowdowns in the actual funds being spent, which is what the Biden administration was partially pointing to, it's really them making it harder to spend the money and really slamming on the brake and trying to limit the impact of the program we see. So that's the story.
That's all you want to say about the politics of charters?
Oh no, we've got an hour though, right? That way I'll keep going.
Derrell, you're a veteran observer of the movement. Talk a little bit about the current state of the charter school movement and what makes the challenges now different and, I assume, steeper than in the past.
Yeah, I mean, to build on Christy's comprehensive yet politically neutral sort of description of what's going on in the administration on all of this. No, it was good. It was strategic. So I do just there are a couple of things that are going on. So we should just be honest about the fact that when President Biden was campaigning in South Carolina, 4 years ago, he said, "I don't favor charter schools. I favor fixing the traditional public schools." Right, in a room full of African-American families, and we know what the polling says about how African-American families feel about charter schools, and I was kind of like, why do you want to kick this dog? This is unnecessary, and just to put it out there, there's never in my lifetime, professional lifetime, been an administration that whose policy priorities are more intertwined with that of the the AFT and the NEA. I think we all know the AFT and the NEA are no friends to charter school growth. Sure. And in places where they are most powerful, charter schools are growing most slowly, despite enhanced and increased demand. A place like New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, whatever. So I think it's really important to kind of put that all out there. That said, I am a great supporter of charter schools, but the game has changed, right? And and you sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier. So the political calculus around starting public schools that help close achievement gaps for low-income kids of color who don't have a lot of educational opportunity has changed. That is no longer, in my opinion, sufficient rationale specifically among Democrats of at the congressional level and a lot of places at the local level to continue to expand charter schools, which is why in a place like New York, basically we can't lift the charter cap for New York City anymore, despite the fact that there are way more people there. add to that the sort of great switching, maybe that's what we would call it, that is the school effects of the post-pandemic. So, tripling of the amount of black families at homeschool, 1 in 17 kids in America, I saw this today on the interwebs, is now homeschooling. And then certainly there is now a new kid who is sort of exciting and boisterous at the party, and that kid's name is Education Savings Account. And so the landscape that used to sort of be like 3 people, you had kind of like your districts, and you had charter schools that were like the fair-haired child of all of this, and then you had like private schools over here, and whether or not you're going to finance them. That's now like a more dynamic landscape. And so there's the traditionals, there are charter schools, there are private schools still, and then there's this whole new world of what might happen if we just kind of give families money that is emergent. And charter schools need to figure out how to play in that more dynamic landscape. Now, I would argue, and you can go online and look up Christy Wolfe and Chipotle, and a piece. Well, I'm keeping it real, right? so like, I didn't make that up. So a piece will present itself to you about ways that charter schools can work in a world of flexible finance, which is kind of like what an education savings account is. Like, charter schools are a way to rationalize personalization if you're going to pay for things that way, which I think is pretty cool. But the other sort of part of this is that when the charter school movement started, which started before when I was in high school, there were no charter schools, right? Which I think is sort of an important thing to talk about. Like, all of this is ephemeral, like this didn't always exist. It's been a huge achievement to have all 700 to 800 charter schools in America with 3 million kids and 200,000 teachers in them, roughly. Like, that's a big deal. But the risk tolerance for chartering has changed, and we can talk a little bit about why that is if you want to. But the movement started with a bias toward trying new things, right? And then the politics changed, and the bias changed toward trying things we knew. Mm-hmm. That's really good, by the way. Yeah. That's the first time. And so you go from the innovation business to the replication business, and there have been lots of benefits to that. I'm a board member at Success Academy. I'm ride or die for it, right? That's a product of the best instincts of the replication business. But there is more that has to be done. If you want more people to be interested in charter schools, you want more different people to attend them, and ultimately, I think if you want to be a better actor in a more sort of fragmented landscape in the future.
Yeah, I mean, for years I've made the point, not necessarily with enthusiasm, that it shouldn't surprise us if authorizers are small c conservative, because, hey, it's taxpayer dollars, so it makes sense to replicate what works. Do you really want to spend taxpayer dollars on wild experimentation?
Nobody, no politician, no authorizer, no school leader, I know we got some school leaders in here, probably have someone on Zoom, wants to see their school and their face above the fold, right?
Yeah.
so like that is all rational and understood. But if there was ever a time for risk, right, or to return to it, it is now, given the scale of the intervention that is still necessary post-COVID, given some of the behaviors about the traditional district systems that have presented themselves as a result of that, which I cannot, sort of unsee, and given the fact that there's more competition in all kinds of ways that sort of mirror the regulatory environment of the first charter schools, now is the time, I think, to revisit that whole proposition.
Thank you. To be continued. Before I forget, I was remiss in not mentioning up top, for those who are following on Zoom, you can submit questions, which we'll go to shortly or a little while, at #AEI-Charters. That's #AEI-Charters. Okay, speaking of radical experimentation, there's a reason, Dr. Baxendale, that I invited you here. I'm a long time I'm fascinated by Great Hearts. It's for those of us who are on the East Coast. Great Hearts is that those classical schools out there in Arizona that we've heard a lot about. But Great Hearts is playing in both arenas, right? In other words, these have been very successful classical charter schools for several years, and then this year you've opened some private classical Christian academies with ESA dollars.
That's right, yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that decision? Because that's what one could assume. Well, we're hedging our bets.
Or exploiting the public policy opportunity as it presents itself.
Fair.
Spreading out bets, perhaps.
Okay.
So you're right, Robert. We've opened two now still relatively small private Christian ESA funded schools in metropolitan Phoenix. There are several reasons why we're doing that. One of the kind of preeminent reasons is we're kind of pro-choice generally as an organization, and we think that the introduction of the ESAs is something that should be supported by supply-side action now that demand has been sort of liberalized by enfranchising a whole sort of new group of people who previously couldn't access private schools because they didn't have the financial means. And so as an organization, we think it's important to do the commensurate piece on the supply side and stand up some excellent schools that are now going to be accessible to a new demographic of people. So that's why we've opened one school in a very low income, primarily minority part of on the western side of downtown Phoenix, and then we're doing a school in a sort of outer suburbia, which is sort of more middle class. But that's one primary motivator, is essentially saying we like choice and we want to bolster this by showing that the ESAs are actually making a difference and getting more people to access high quality schools. Another reason is, that we think working in a faith-based environment is highly compatible with a lot of the, sort of tenets of classical education. Indeed, there's a very strong classical Christian tradition, and so, the ESA model is an opportunity to do, Christian classical education in partnership with church facilities, which is another, it's a principled reason, but it's also a highly pragmatic one. Chris, you alluded to the difficulties that charter schools have in finding facilities, finding capital, and getting started, and that's where the charter school program has been so instrumental for charter schools. But the sort of voucher or ESA world is still so new that there aren't these sorts of attendant sort of grants and programs that assist voucher-funded schools to actually get, startup capital, secure a facility, and so on. So in working in partnership with churches, which increasingly these days, have vacant space or underutilized space, we can, pretty quickly and in a fairly agile way stand up high-quality schools in real estate that is otherwise being sort of underutilized. So the host of reasons, really, both sort of high-minded and also just very pragmatic.
But can I ask you? And I'm a curriculum instruction guy at the end of the day. I'm not a school governance or that type of person. But just looking at it from that perspective, I feel like I'd rather be a low-cost private school than a charter school, right?
I think,
assuming that you can make a go of it on the budget.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
Is
potentially.
It easier?
It probably is easier. You would sort of unburdened from certain regulations and so on. I don't know that we would see obligations to, for example, submit to state testing and so on as a problem as an organization. I think we'd be happy to sort of see ourselves measured by that yardstick. I know others in the ESA movement, and apologies to Corey DeAngelis, would think I was sort of a terrible squish for saying that, but I'm fine with testing actually. But there are certainly other more sort of onerous burdens that come along with being a charter school that you are sort of freed of if you're voucher supported. It is a meaningful difference, though, in terms of funding. I mean, in Arizona, it's around $10,000 per pupil per year that you get as a charter operator as the kind of base level of funding. The base level of funding for an ESA student who doesn't have additional loadings for disability or so on is around $7,500, right. And that's that's quite a margin. Yeah,
right.
It's tough. We are supporting our sort of fledgling Christian classical schools with quite a bit of additional philanthropy.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Christy, this kind of brings me to the nub of the question, which is what exactly is the role for charters now in this, again, fast-moving change in the American ecosystem, where you've got 13 states that are effectively saying, "Here, take the state's money and buy yourself some education." So the dynamism argument, it's hard to compete, when you've got parents literally choosing their own educational adventure. So where do you see, where does the Alliance see the role for charters vis-a-vis the value proposition of we're delivering a dynamic education to kids?
Right. Well, I think it's important to, at a baseline, recognize that despite that all the activity around ESAs is in part a fruit of the fact that there's more choice, there's more charters, and it's new and shiny, and that's also potentially, or to a large extent, reflective of the fact that charter law is stable. And for the most part, there's 47 states that have laws, and we're working to improve them. We're staving off attacks on them, but we're just in a very different place as a movement as ESAs are. That being said, I mean, there is certainly a continuum, and the continuum's been extended, I think, as Derrell described. I think chartering is a place for families that potentially don't want to, that want to be in a public school that provides them with options or ways to tailor education that's not putting all the onus on them to potentially design their own education, as you would in Arizona with an ESA if you're trying to start your own micro school or a pod. As a public school, as well as open to all kids, if you have a student with dyslexia or other needs, you know that you can go to that school and expect that your child will be served. So I think it's providing, it's as part of the continuum, ESAs are additive, and it's a tool that can be used within the context of chartering. It's not like there's only this amount of choice to be had in any state, and now we have to divide the pot more. Everyone gets a smaller piece of the pie. I think it's just ways to get more choice, more options to more families and students.
Can I build on that?
Please.
And kind of to Dr. Baxendale's point, Helen.
You're determined to embarrass me.
Dr. B. So not everybody will agree with this, but I actually think, and we have an example here, right, that 25, 30 years worth of experience from chartering is an accelerant to what can happen in the in ESA world. It is a high bar, though lots of people are doing it. To choose your own adventure, I used to love those books. And just go out and be like, give me mine. I'm gonna put it together, And I'm excited that some people are gonna do that, in part because the rule set is so different than authorizing what we know, that some new things might happen, right? At the same time, just to this point about supply, right? It's much easier to say, we have a thing that's here, like there are some things we could do in a different finance and regulatory framework quickly, because we have a network of charter schools that already exists. Like, why don't we do that as one way to approach this? That there are some states that have passed ESAs that don't have a lot of private school participants, and it's attractive as an option potentially for charter schools to be like, we can help fill this gap. So that's kind of one thing. There are other things that charter schools are also very good at, like recruiting students, like enrollment, like building support structures for like educational enterprises.
Good at being a school and having a place.
That's right. Good at having a building. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, and look, like, you may want free range, right? But not everybody does. Sometimes people are like, I want half range, So I still want to be able to show up to a building sometimes to do whatever, and that's the thing. And the place where I think it's will be like sort of super advantageous is in the incubation, area, right? So just to your point, we talked about facilities. For the most part, charter schools have them. They must have them, right? If I'm a potential startup, maybe my proof of concept is easier to do with 10 kids in a room in an existing charter school who are ESA, students, than it is to get to mess with the administration, get them to give me my $40 million so I can actually open the school, go find 500 kids to get the proof of concept, and then in 5 years be like, okay, this worked or it didn't work. So I think this is like and I want to add one other thing on this. I think this is the time to basically, like, if you like movies, it's like the end of Empire, where Lando is there, and he goes, this wasn't the deal, and Vader goes, I'm altering the deal, right? So all of this is happening under a set of covenants that we made 30 years ago, right? Particularly in charter world, we'll do more for less, right? That was because efficiency was part of the argument. The argument probably should have been, we'll do better for the same, right? And so every kid in America is still a casualty of school finance, because that was the rationale we made 30 years ago. Let's come back and alter that deal, right? Like, the whole landscape is much more dynamic now. Like, we should go back in for all of it, not just some of it.
You said do better for less or the same. When you say do better, that implies accountability. Can we talk about that for a second? To what degree? And look, for 30 years, we've kind of hung our hat on that, right? Look at the test scores. Hey, all we need to do is be better than that. And let's face it, that's a low bar. Now you've got ESA proponents coming along who are saying we don't want, the first and last word in accountability is parents voting with their feet. Would any of you like to kind of say a word for accountability, test-driven accountability as a calling card for charters? You want to go first?
Look, I'll buy. Look, I think it's important. But I work for a network of schools that has never regarded the state test results as its raison d'etre, as its North Star, and I love that about Great Hearts. There are more important things, like sort of the character of the students we produce, their affection for the higher things, and so on, that we think no matter how sort of thoughtfully contrived a state test is, it's not going to capture.
But by the way, you get good test scores.
Conveniently enough, yes. And we care about it. I would be disingenuous to say we don't care about it. We do care about it. It's just not the thing that we prize most. And it's interesting to me that, I think the charter school movement is like the earnest apple polishing student that did all the right things. They turned in their assignments on time. They got great scores. They ticked all the boxes. They took the SAT and they got a 1400. I don't know. I'm revealing my ignorance here. That's a perfect score?
Better than I got.
And then a little bit like what happened with college admissions, they moved the goalposts. It's like we don't do sorry, standardized tests aren't the thing anymore. The zeitgeist shifted, I think, a little bit. And so we have the now third Credo report, the sort of gold standard meta-analysis from Stanford University that's showing the charter school movement is doing exactly what it promised to do for some of the most needy, low-income minority kids, and it's not moving the dial. So it's interesting to me that the kind of hook that the charter movement hung its hat on and did a pretty good job with, really, has somehow not been enough to secure the ongoing political support of the Democratic Party. And then I think on the other side, for various reasons that we can go into if you're inclined, the Republican Party has kind of moved on to the more interesting shiny thing of ESAs. Yeah.
So can I add? So
yeah, please.
I think it's not like mistake is the wrong word to describe it, but I think there's an opportunity to look at this differently. So the way this discussion is emerging is like either you like test-based accountability, or you want people to vote with their feet, right? And that is not a binary way to. That's not a binary proposition. There's a range there, and what charter schools are uniquely situated to do is work at both ends of the range. The thing they have not done is work at both ends of the range normally. They've worked at the test-based accountability end of the range. And a couple of things about that. So there are lots of parents who like this. So again, like, I go to the Success Academy graduation. I see a lot of kids who knocked it out of the park, on all the things that matter, who care about the higher things, like, we're not making robots, who are going on to the best schools. And I see their parents losing their minds over it, right? I mean, it's like the happiest of happy. It's like, it's so fulfilling to be there. It's like, it's hard not to cry, right? And so we, that network, other networks like it or whatever, lots of us sold that as a way to think about success. And we built schools around, and lots of families looked at it and said, I want that. And lots of families still look at that and say, I want that. the thing now is that people are saying, some families are saying, I want something else as well, right? And so the opportunity to do that is a challenge. To your point of earlier, you raised it earlier, like a narrow approach that minimizes risk and defines success in a very specific way. And look, we got a lot of good stuff, out of that, and we should keep doing that for the families who want it. But the politics of making charter public schools has to also update itself to sort of meet the demands of other families who want other things, including some of whom are our traditional constituencies.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And if I could just add on
No,
to the add-on.
Please.
I think that a through line through a lot of these, the push for ESAs, the push for certain types of charter schools, is a real prioritization of school culture, especially post-COVID.
Sorry, did you say privatization?
Prioritization.
Okay.
Prioritization.
I thought you said privatization.
Yeah,
For a second. I was like, what panel did I show up to?
Yeah. Prioritization of school culture. I mean, we're seeing rapid growth in classical schools. Some of the highest numbers we have for school openings are in the classical realm. Sure. I think that people are looking for a school that cares for them. On the accountability side, the friction in the charter sector is, yeah, we can knock it out of the park on the test, we're fine with taking the test, but we want to also show what we are giving these kids in terms of school culture. And no one's really come up with a way, at least beyond certain authorizer school relationships, to elevate that. And that's something that we can contribute not just as schools, but to the country in terms of accountability and folks feeling like our school, we're capturing everything that we're bringing to these kids, the full success, and not just the college entrance rates, which are all, again, they're important, but I think that that's the friction in the charter sector, that our mission is not being fully reflected in some cases in what we're being held to. And by the way, the public schools down the street next to us are not being held to anything.
Sure. Okay, let me make a prediction. In your conversations with lawmakers, federal or state, first I'm guessing that you're neutral as a charter alliance on ESAs. Choices, we're good with all choice, at least publicly. I'm guessing that's the party line. But I'm also going to guess that at least privately, in your conversations with lawmakers, you're like, we're accountable. You can see our results. Support us, right? That's part of the pitch?
Well, there aren't, so
because by the way, just to make it easier on you, for years the Democrats have said, oh, charter schools aren't accountable at all.
Right.
Which is nonsense.
Yeah, right.
But shoes on the other foot now.
Yeah, and there are the places where there are ESA activities right now, and to be fair, we have a state team that handles all of those, so I'm not actually out there having the state legislative conversations, but again, it's not zero sum. It's not like, okay, which ones are we going to do this year? Is it charters or ESAs? Most of them have, in Arizona, they've had charter laws. Yeah. It's we're now putting an X amount of funding towards them, but even
or an expansion of one includes the growth of the other.
Right.
These two things have tended to travel together, and I think that's an important point.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and even the enrollment in Arizona has held steady for charters, not like it's tanking and all of a sudden everyone's moving to private schools. So yes, we are accountable. I think that we are another way, perhaps a less out there way for some, to expand choice. And I think that there are some really creative things that can be done at the state level for folks who are more comfortable and want to maintain a bipartisan coalition. That's the thing. You start seeing this. There's the red choice states and there's the blue version of choice. And I think what we want to do is try to keep the center together. How can we provide as many choices given the impact that charters are having, that CRETA is showing? How can we get that to more kids, to more students with disabilities, to rural areas, to all those places?
It's got to be frustrating, though, right? I mean, look, I'm an unabashed charter fan. I used to teach in one. I used to work for a CMO. You look at the CRETA studies. I've written that, the ed reform movement, the one thing that it is a clear, unambiguous victory is urban charter schools. You'd much rather be a low-income black or brown kid in a charter school in virtually any major American city today than a similar kid 25, 30 years ago. So why does nobody love charter schools?
Well, thankfully, it's not nobody, but the politicization of support for charter schools and the disregard of what actually the outcomes are for kids is infuriating. When we had the hearing that you testified at earlier this year, where they intentionally ensure that Democratic school supporters are not on that committee, so that they can voice charter support. The president, doesn't have a lot of room to mess with key constituencies of his that are strong charter supporters in urban areas. And yet he goes out of his way to make a cut to a program that appeals to a very narrow segment of his votes, frankly, and that they're already going to vote for him. So yes, we have to push back every year now on the National Charter School Resolution in the Senate for folks that disagree with the methodology now of Credo. All of a sudden Credo, their results are questionable because it's in support of charter schools.
Because it's good.
Yeah, and so
Because it's good.
yeah, so I'm a wonk. At the end of the day, you want to believe that the evidence is going to sway people, but really at the end of the day, it's the politics, and that's what's infuriating.
There you go. One more time, the hashtag, we'll go to questions in a moment, hashtag AEI Charters. Derrell, before we started, you said something intriguing, and I want you to kind of say more about it because we didn't get a chance to pursue the conversation. Despite, and I will admit, I'm being a bit of an Eeyore here today and presenting a dour picture.
That's a core knowledge reference. Way to go.
But you said there's never been a better time to be in charters. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so, okay. So, I can remember I had just given the closing keynote at the Georgia Charter School Association's annual event. And it was Friday the 13th, 2020. And I was in the airport and reading the New York Post and finding out that Success Academy was gonna go virtual on Monday. Right.
Oh, this was the 13th when COVID hit.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yeah, March 13, 2020 Sorry.
Movie.
Yes.
And who, I didn't know all hell was going to break loose after that, and everything that we sort of know. But I think we learned a lot about the incentives that the traditional public education system operates under. That if you pay schools to be closed, they'll be closed. And when we're looking at I say attempts, air quotes, because I don't know if you really call them attempts, to remediate the harm of that, in particular on low-income kids of color who are clustered in cities. Our city, states, and nation has not taken it seriously enough, right? And so I actually think lots of people know that. I think lots of families know that. I think lots of kids know that. I think lots of politicians know it, but don't want to say it out loud. And I think there is a tacit understanding of the fact that the system that we have now was not up to the challenge before, and is absolutely not up to it post-COVID. And the harm of the last 3 years, I think, is going to be with us for the next 30 if we don't do something profound. So I only highlight all of that to say that it's bad, it's not great, but the temperature among families for change has gone up like a lot. And all the polling that we see, and look, the data that you see, right? Like a million kids have said, I'm out of the school I was in before. I'm doing it my own way. I'm picking a charter school. I'm going to private school, whatever. Like we've literally never seen anything like this in our lifetimes, right? And there's a baby blessed. The fiscal cliff's coming. The money's like all of these sort of like black swan things are all happening all at once. And so, there's some bad in it, but the scale of the disruption is an opportunity to rethink better, right? And rethink different. I mean, I think this is an important point. Like, there's a lot of polling that says, some families want better, but they want different just as much, and that wasn't the same 5 years ago, and it wasn't the same, 15 years ago. And so whether or not you favor ESAs or vouchers or whatever, which I happen to, or whether or not you are a charter school loyalist, as I also am. If you run a district school, you need to be thinking about doing something dramatically different, because the opportunity to get the policymaker that will let you do that to say yes is higher now than it has ever been. So I throw that out there to be like, we had the same system for like 150 years.
Yeah.
It's what we always talk about. Like, now's a time to do something different.
And it's unprecedented as well, because all of the districts are facing this fiscal cliff at the same time. It's not just a one-off and a district can brush it off. It's like, well, we'll just make some tweaks. Now everyone's talking about the fact that you guys really should be closing buildings. Why aren't you closing buildings? Why aren't you merging? So it is unprecedented.
But am I correct? And I live in New York, where I spent my entire career in New York. All the charter sector has done in New York is everything that, from a public policy perspective, you could have ever wanted them to do. Just terrific charter school models. There's a charter cap that is, the sun is going to go out before that charter cap is lifted in New York. Okay, it's just not going to happen. If I'm a charter leader, I'd love to think that these efforts and dynamism will be rewarded. I just don't see it happening in New York. So am I? And by the way, Eva Moskowitz of Success Academy, you're on their board. I never thought I'd live to see this happen. She's talking to Florida about opening schools in Florida. Yeah. And she's got a single city model. So is that the future of the charter movement? You just go where the political climate is better?
So that is absolutely one future, but you also pull a great Hearts. So here's the heresy I've been sitting on. I'm ready to roll it out. We'll see whether I can make it out of the room alive. Okay, so part of the challenge of charter schooling in the places that we most traditionally associate with it, or at least I do, right? Like the Northeast in particular, is like where my whole career is.
Boston, Washington.
You got it. New York City, Newark, Camden, all these places, right? The political constituency for charters is narrow. It is narrow in terms of who supports them, the income of the people who support them.
It's just parents.
That's right. And where they are. And where they are. That's the most important thing. So
they're in safe seats.
That's right. Like, if you're in, like, all the charter support in New York City is in Rochester, and in New York State is in Rochester, New York City. So if you're any place else, you feel nothing for doing nothing. And that is because the charter school constituency is not diverse, right? It is not diverse in terms of income, location, model enough to build a political constituency that can uncap it in the New York instance. And so I think this is one of the things that the West, and please talk about this, has sorted out. Like, there are 200,000 kids in charter schools in Arizona. They're just as likely to be in ASU prep, right? Think no excuses, close achievement gap, as they are to be in Great Hearts. Think suburban soccer mom interested in the classics. And because of that, charter schools are safe, right? Charter schools can grow, charter schools are gonna be okay. So this to me is like this is actually existential, because to keep with the same political approach means we will only have what we have had in places where we know it best. And if you wanna extend that opportunity to more kids, you have to make sure that more kids can actually attend charter school.
What I think I hear you saying is the original sin of the Ed Reform Coalition was making charters about low-income kids of color in inner cities.
I think that was the best and most correct decision at the time, and the politics have changed.
I think that was the only opening that
that's
charter
true.
schools had at the time. So they had to go where the opening was. I mean, the vested interests, essentially, that was all the ground that they would cede. They had basically said, look, we haven't done very well with this constituency. I guess you can try. And the likes of Eva Moskowitz and others, to their eternal credit, tried and succeeded brilliantly. But I couldn't agree more with Derrell's point around the political constituency in the kind of heartland of chartering in the Northeast, that it makes it inherently, politically handicapped sort of force, and it's too bad. I mean, Phoenix and Arizona is a kind of case study in how it can be different. And as a suburban soccer mom, or at least an aspiring one, I've got to put in a word for Great Heights here. One of the reasons I think we have fared so well and largely been left alone by, the kind of regulatory state there, and indeed enjoyed great support from both sides of politics in Arizona, is because we span, even as a network, the entire socioeconomic spectrum. We are racially and ethnically diverse, so it's not just the suburban soccer mom in Scottsdale who wants her kids, to sort of be familiar with, Thucydides. It's the Latino landscaper out in Buckeye who wants his kid to have the best education available. And that, I think, is how you build an enduring constituency for charter schools. And that's what I think charters have to find a way to do in other parts of the country where they have traditionally been the preserve and sort of elevator of, more concentrated and less diverse constituencies, like you said, yeah.
So Helen, if I can just follow up, Great Hearts has expanded in recent years to Texas, Louisiana.
Across the Sun Belt, yeah.
Okay.
Basically tracking across the I-10, yeah.
Tell me, how does that process work? Do they come to you and say, hey, we want Great Hearts, or are you seeking opportunities?
It's a little of both. It's both a sort of an art and a science. I maintain a kind of running spreadsheet that analyzes a whole bunch of different factors that we think are important in terms of finding a hospitable sort of home for a new Great Hearts region. We're always trying to do more than just one school in one region because obviously, there are economies of scale and so on. And it's a proprietary formula, so I won't go into the specifics. But you can imagine the sort of things we're looking at. We're looking to go to places that have a growing K-12 population, or at least not a contracting one. We're looking for places that have a hospitable charter policies where getting authorized isn't a monumental ordeal. We're looking for sort of the sorts of demographics that are probably going to be open to or interested in what classical education is. And so these sort of Sunbelt states where there are people flocking to them for opportunity and affordable housing, where they tend to have children, which is also something that is not something you can take for granted in some parts of the country anymore. Yeah. Those are the kinds of places where we're always looking to go. But then we always want to push on an open door, and it's even better if someone will open that door, grab your hand, and pull you in. And that's where, really, that's the definitive difference about, like I can sit in Phoenix and sort of do all of these cold-blooded sort of quantitative analyses, but what really makes a difference for us is when some, local group of philanthropists or community leaders, calls us and says, we think Great Hearts would be wonderful here, and oh, by the way, we know a property developer who is doing a planned community, and he really thinks that a Great Hearts school would add tremendous value to what he's trying to do, so let's talk about that. Or there've been harbor master organizations right now in I want to give a shout out to New Schools for Louisiana and New Schools for Baton Rouge who have been tremendously helpful to getting our most recent campus off the ground in Baton Rouge. So it's that sort of thing.
How many total Great Heart schools are there right now, including the Christos private schools?
Not enough.
40. Well, including Christos schools, 48.
So yeah. 46. Charters
yes.
to
ESA funded
privates.
Privates,
okay,
yeah.
So here's the $64,000 question. 10 years from now, I'm not going to ask you to predict what that number will be, but of the schools that you open in the next 2 years, how many of them will be charters and how many of them will be ESA, so-called low-cost or modest-cost private schools in those
That's
areas?
A question probably better addressed to Governor Hobbs.
Okay.
So for the benefit of our audience,
it's very diplomatic.
The ESA law is under some sort of scrutiny by the Democratic Party, and the Democratic governor of Arizona has made it known that she would like to see modifications to it at the very least.
When you say modifications, I think you mean strangled until dead?
Your words, not mine.
Okay.
We'll see. But there are tax credit options, and there are plenty of other states as well that are already introduced ESA.
Many of the states that you're looking at are ESA states.
The challenge for all of this is startup capital.
Sure.
And finding a facility. And that is that's a considerable nut that you have to find and assemble. So if there are any white knight philanthropists out there who would like to see Great Hearts sort of come to their part of the world, that's really the the impediment to growth, the most important one.
There's another, I mean, everything's important, but there's like one other thing about this. So like BASIS is like is another sort of similar profile school, right? Like very high achieving, whatever. And you can go to BASIS in New York City. You just have to pay tuition for it, right?
And
So,
Virginia too, right?
Oh, I didn't know there was one in Virginia, right?
$25,000 and you're into BASIS. I keep telling people, like, Virginia, we don't have any charter schools. BASIS, example, you could go there for free. In DC, you can go there free, but in Virginia, it's 25 grand.
That's right. So I do think that we do have proof that if these things were publicly financed in some of the places we've been talking about, that somebody would be kicking the door down to get into them, which I think is really important. But the other thing too, and it's like we were sort of talking about this, earlier, is that along with the ESA discussion is also one about the income of the people who participate, and I just highlight that because charter schools don't have means tests, right? But ESAs, everyone wants them to, right? And all of everything to the sort of intellectual right of charters has a means test for the most part. And this is like a really important discussion to have, especially if what you want is to diversify the constituency for charters, right? So, and if you want to take advantage of the fact that there's more innovative finance or whatever, like you're going to want to have everybody in the coalition you can. And like a very specific example of this, so in North Carolina, when they were passing their ESA law, I remember there was a very specific move to lower the income limit on it. And I knew exactly why they were doing that, because it turns out Democrats like to send their kids to private schools too. And I say this is one of them, right? But I don't have any kids. But I know that this is a thing Democrats like to do. And so, the jujitsu is like, we're going to keep these people out of the program because then it's easier to assault. Mm-hmm. And instead, right, like what they passed kept the income limit relatively high, and now there's like 100,000 people or something on the wait list to get into the next round, which is politically working as intended. So I just wanted to like highlight the the 4D chess around why you want a more diverse constituency. That constituency has to include sort of like wealthier people, why that gives charter schools an opportunity to expand in a way that they currently can only do in the private sector in places. And with public finance, you can basically do just about everything you want to.
Okay, we're going to go to audience questions at #AEI Charters in just a moment. One last naked politics question. It's AEI, so I think I can safely ask this question here. Are the Democrats going to rue the day that they turn their backs on charters? Are they going to pay a political price for it? Because they are still very popular with parents, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's no political gains that are going to be garnered by, at least looking at the federal level, the Biden administration turned their back. I think it could come to bear in certain key areas. Is education the top issue for voters in federal elections this fall?
Probably not.
Probably not. But I think in the down ballot races and state races, I think that even our friends at Democrats for Education Reform are seeing an openness to choice, and people are, why does it matter what my zip code is? I should be able to go to any public school, and once you have more Democrats on that, it's just catnip for the next level of choice and the expansion of ESAs. So yes, I think that they will regret opposing.
Yeah, and we've already seen a lot of anti-choice Republicans being primaried and maybe perhaps more on ESAs.
I think that's happening in the background right now, actually. This is going on. I would just say that normally these things require enormous political courage because you have to be in front of popular sentiment to get the policy done. It is exactly the opposite way right now. Families are way out in front. They're like, we like it all, right? And this is a red state rural Republican problem as much as it is an urban democratic machine, problem. And I think it might not show up in a primary, but the way it shows up in a general, I think, is in disinterest is the deal. I don't feel like you care about me. I don't feel like you care about my kid's education, right? Why do you not like the school my kid goes to? You know what? I'm hanging this one out. And not for nothing, in 10 years, there can be a lot of kids who graduate from charter schools that are ready to run for office.
Oh, and we're already seeing in staff, in congressional offices, more and more often, like, oh yeah, I went to this charter school, and that changes the conversation. You can get meetings now just because there isn't the visceral, oh my gosh, you're a charter school. So that is changing the game. We've had 2 bills in Congress this year introduced standalone bipartisan bills, and we had so many people, especially in the Senate, in one bill that was empowering teachers to open charter schools. And we have 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and we had to cut it off, at least for introduction. So yeah, there's Democrats are still very interested in demonstrating that they haven't turned their back, at least some.
Okay. I said we're going to go to questions. Helen, did you want to weigh in? I'm sorry.
The only thing I was going to say is I hope so, Robert. And I think there's an opportunity for a very talented political entrepreneur to kind of step into the breach here, and a little bit like what Corey DeAngelis and his friends have done with ESAs. I mean, that issue wasn't really anywhere.
Yeah.
As recently as 4 or 5 years ago, and now 13 states and counting have almost universal ESAs. So I think it's a lesson in how a sort of talented political entrepreneur can sort of prosecute a case, and I think something like that for the charter movement, some sort of revivalist sort of energy could absolutely I think be what's called for.
But I'm thinking back to the early days, and I'm old enough to remember when the first KIPP school or second KIPP school opened just down the street from where I was teaching 5th grade in the South Bronx. So my own memory of the kind of the energy and entrepreneurism that went into those early schools is a real memory for me. I've been saying to a couple of people in the last year or so, hey, if I were half my age right now, I would be moving to an ESA state and starting the low-cost private school, core knowledge, that's my particular flavor of curriculum, the low-cost private core knowledge school of my dreams. Would any of you like to convince me that I'd be better off moving to that state and opening a charter school instead?
Depends on the state.
Well, that's right. Pick a state and tell me where I'm going.
I think Florida, you got a good shot at it. I think Arizona, you got a good. Colorado, I mean, not have ESAs, but Colorado's friendly to this. Texas, Utah. I think the important thing about your provocation is that the cost to try is significant, right? And so you can say, all right, I'm going to go charter. The money is there already. And that, there's CSP and there's other things.
$2 million to cover your startup.
And that ostensibly makes it easier in terms of resources. But you get regulation with it, right? And you as an entrepreneur, at Entrepreneur, have to decide whether or not you are willing to forego that or can forego that to get your ESA idea up and off the ground. And I think if Robert, I don't mean to gas you up, but I think if you were going to start a core knowledge ESA schools, and people would be like, oh yeah, it's Pondiscio school, so maybe you wouldn't have this problem. But everybody has to, everyone who wants to start a school has to make that trade-off. I think that's a good thing, though, because before it was like you got to start charter school or nothing, essentially, and now there's more options out there.
And you could start both.
Yeah. We are going to go to audience questions, and it occurs to me while I've been giving out the hashtag, we've got a few questions from Twitter, a bunch actually. I should ask if there's any questions here in the room before we throw it to our remote audience.
Is that because we really don't have any questions online?
No, we actually do. Well, I've been sitting on this one question, which I love because this is confirmation bias on my part. I'm an unabashed fan of the so-called no excuses schools, and I'm probably the last person in this work who still uses that term unironically because I remember what it meant. It meant no excuses for adults. So here's a question, somebody of my own heart. Would the return of no excuses charters help or hurt the charter movement at this time? I think it's fair to say that a lot of the momentum for the movement was built on those schools back in the day. Why did that model fall away? What could bring it back?
I don't know that it's fallen away. I think the terminology has changed. I would say that, I don't know if Eva still says we're no excuse.
I call it high structure.
High
But
structure.
yeah, I think the death of high structure has been greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
Like when you look at the waiting lists and all, and there is high demand for high structure, formerly known as no excuses, charter schools. This is always a great thing. The no excuses issue to me surfaces the differences in what parents want. So there's and a disrespect for parents that don't want what you want, right? So like part of the landscape is that parents want different things. That's what part of what charter schools are here to address. I think there's some families that are like, I don't like all that high structure. Like, I don't like to focus on college. I don't like whatever. So nobody should like it, right? And that is the sort of framework in which no excuses, I think, has come to be viewed. Like the Success Academy, we got 22,000 kids. We got 22,000 authorizers. If they don't like no excuses. They got no excuse. There's no excuse. They can shut us down tomorrow. So I think they remain an important option, and I'm going to roll with what the parents want. I cut you off, Christy. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was pitching it to you for your perspective there. I think that there has been in the news, maybe backing away from the turn, and some of the policies on suspensions. Maybe some schools had gone too far on dress code infractions, but it's all part of a philosophy. Again, a philosophy with alignment of what parents want at home. Again, I think what ESAs are trying to empower more of that. Like, we want the school to reflect our values, want our kids to grow up in a certain type of culture. And I think that the results for no excuses are certainly high, and what was successful about those models should continue.
Sure. Question directly for Christy, and I may have to interpret this one. It says, is charter law stability a hindrance or a feature for charter schools in the current climate? I assume the questioner means the structure as opposed to what we were describing as the choose your own adventure nature of ESAs. In other words, is a little structure good here? A selling point.
Yeah, I mean, stability maybe also within reference to ESAs, right, where a governor may come in and say, completely want to change the policies. But I think, the structure of we have a building, we have a school, we're getting a per pupil allocation, we are being held accountable for a certain amount of time, you being here, but maybe with some flexibility to learn from home a certain day. But I think it's like the parents that want maybe some 20% innovation, but 80% like something they could recognize as a school. Charters can certainly offer that if that's what they're looking for. I think charters can offer more customization, but I think there is comfort in knowing that at the end of the day, this policy is not going to disappear off our state statute, and the funding, and just the track record of public accountability and transparency.
We kind of answered this one, or at least we name-checked a few states, but I'll just repeat the question here verbatim. Which states are looking like they'll be friendlier for charter schools in the future, and why? Is it just the ESA states?
Yeah, probably.
And high growth states.
And high growth states.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there've been meaningful improvements. I mean, I know you're having Governor Reynolds here. Is it tomorrow or next week? Iowa has made big strides on both counts. Yeah. And that's a case in point of a state that is not only adopted ESAs but also in the process sort of improved the chartering environment. So I think there is progress. It's just it tends to be sort of west of the Mississippi more often than not at the moment.
Yeah, Arkansas. I mean, this is really interesting. Like Arkansas passed an ESA, lifted the cap on charter schools, raised teacher salary, and did science and reading all at the same time, right? So I do think it's important to sort of notice that like lots of these things are happening together, right? Like more. It's the Frank Lloyd Wright quote, less is more unless more is better. This is more is better.
Yeah, Utah, same thing.
Utah's the same
massively
thing,
increase teacher salaries, introduce an ESA, and improve the chartering environment as well. So,
Ohio did science of reading. So there's a lot of Ohio is one that you could also add to the list.
Yeah.
At the risk of diverting us, having the thought to ask this question, just about trying to attract teachers. How's that going? Because I'm looking at you, Helen, because you're everything I've heard from classical schools is it's challenging to find people who were brought up in this tradition who can now teach it. Doesn't seem to be holding Great Hearts back. I assume it's a
challenge. I mean, it is a challenge, and to the extent that we're succeeding at it, it's due to the tremendous work of a few people in our organization who have been managing our national kind of talent search really adroitly and trying to kind of keep ahead of a labor market that it's fair to say is not easy at the moment. But in some ways, sort of having been in a way, a bit of an odd duck in the charter movement, and even more so in the education world, and sourcing our teachers not from traditional sort of pipelines like university education departments and people with B.Eds or M.Eds, but instead the liberal arts classics graduate or the mathematician who decides sort of that they actually have a yin for teaching, and then sort of training them in the classical method through the preceding summer and on the job. That's helped us. And so, I think we once did this analysis and worked out we were probably the largest single employer of classics graduates in the United States at one point. I'm not sure if that's still the case.
Who's the second largest?
University of Chicago, maybe. I don't know. I don't know. Probably another classical network at this point.
There is hope.
Probably.
But I think it's always going to be tough. Part of being a charter network in the western part of the United States or in the Sun Belt means that the funding is never going to be lavish.
Yep.
Our salaries are, we can't pay people what they're really worth. And we're always sort of scrambling to try to find ways to pay teachers more and retain them. But I think one of the things that really is attractive to them is having a school model that is really distinctive and innately appealing and speaks to their kind of love of discipline. Academic discipline.
Yep.
No, as much as I too hold a candle for no excuses, Robert. I mean, so that's key, I think. Yeah.
I should share my thinking in asking the question. We had a question here from our online audience about how important curriculum is in the grand scheme of things.
You sent that question.
Clearly, people they know how to get their question asked because
Is it this important?
Exactly. But no, it raises an issue. We were talking earlier about dynamism, and for years I have kind of shouted into the wilderness. When we've been talking about accountability and test scores, like to me the best argument for choice, for charters, ESAs, whatever, it's not, hey kid, you remember the Arnie Duncan thing about how Common Core that was unpopular because it was like what did he say, white suburban moms?
Yeah.
They find out that the kid
poor
isn't that
soccer
good.
mom.
Yeah, like that's not the argument.
And then they
at all.
cooked him for it, and he stopped saying it.
And look, I'd say deservedly so. He was cooked for it. My point has always been, hey, Mom, your school's fine, but would you like a classical school? Maybe you'd like a Montessori school. Maybe you'd like a project-based learning school. I don't hear that conversation in the charter sector selling those different models. I'm accepting Great Hearts, because Great Hearts obviously does, but do we hear that from the charter sector selling just the different curriculum, the different pedagogical models? Isn't that a good selling point?
You mean, yeah. That's how you're able to match up what families are looking for, and especially in the suburban context, where our local public school is good. And speaking personally for myself, we have great public schools. We pay to send our kids to classical schools. Would have loved a classical charter school. Yeah, I think that is a selling point. I think that is one of the selling points of some of the schools out in California that are hybrid. So you can be at home some days, you can be in a building some days, you can actually choose your curriculum. You could choose to be a Da Vinci curriculum, you can choose classical. So I think, we should probably articulate that a bit more. And clearly the Credo results, I think, are interesting because it's showing that the model itself, curriculum agnostic, if we're allowed to say agnostic, is bringing about results. So it's like harnessing that choice of curriculum with the choice to go to a charter school that's held accountable is producing those results.
Can I say one thing about this? Because it's really important what Christy just raised. All she does is raise important things. So how we talk about charter schools is also a creature of politics. So the opening gambit is we're better and we're gonna show the other guy up. And I think for like 10 years or so, the results are coming in, and that argument worked. And then people like politicos were like, listen, we get that what you're doing, but you gotta take the temperature down a little bit, right? You can't, it's too hot, we wanna help you, but whatever. And so over time, we've gone from talking about how we are different to how we are the same. And like Christy mentioned this earlier, free, public, open to all. Totally true. Sticky, important, and an important way to describe what a charter school is, because it is all those things. But that is none of what Christy just talked about, right? Different curriculum, different approach, different place, different time, different schedule. Those are the things that make us us. And along with the whole, every other thing we talked about is sort of like revisit the compact, like, raise the ask, alter the deal, make a lightsaber, like all of these things. I think we have to, as a movement, get focused on talking about why we are different again, not why we are the same.
Can I say something about that and add a question?
Is the microphone coming to you?
I'm Alex Barron. I'm at Yale Haynes Charter Schools in DC. And I think one of the challenges we're celebrating our 20th year as a school this year. And I think we're talking about if charters should brand themselves a certain way, like we are expeditionary learning, or we have this curriculum or that curriculum. And I think what that leads to is for schools, when they're founding, to grasp at educational faddism, which are definitionally ephemeral. So it's like if expeditionary learning is really hot right now, we might start an expeditionary learning school and say, we do expeditionary learning. But then in 4 years, the movement has moved on. And now people are excited about high-tech highs, project-based learning, and then that's fallen out of favor. And so I find that it's pretty hard for charters to say, here's this other thing that we're offering that families are excited about, because those things so quickly fade. And then we're stuck in this position where we started a school, and now 5 years later, that school is already obsolete because the zeitgeist has changed.
But can I ask you,
Yeah.
It's a compelling argument, but doesn't this relegate you to always being the food court and never the specialty restaurant?
And that's what we are, and that's why so many comprehensive high schools look like the meaningless blobs that they are. And now our 20-year charter, I would say, is functionally non-differentiable from the DCPS school down the street. We're slightly better in instruction, but we offer the same stuff because we started as a STEM school for girls because that's what the community wanted, and then we moved to a core knowledge school, then we moved to project-based, now we're social justice. Social justice is now on its way out, and so now what are we? We don't know. So I just think that's one of the challenges that schools face, and classical never dies. And so classical, and I do see, to me there's some,
For Hemlock.
I'll get to the question in a second. I find some irony in, I know you love classical and you love curriculum instruction, and I hear you as a conservative loving to conserve the classical values and wanting that to be the curriculum forever, but you want to blow up the instruction. You want to change the service delivery model, but keep the curriculum the same. And that leads me to my question, which is ESAs, for example, are now the new frontier of choice and innovation. And I just wonder, to your question to Helen about in 10 years, wouldn't you rather all of them be low-cost private schools? At some point, if the market share of ESA schools grows, wouldn't we want there to be some accountability on an increasing size of taxpayer dollars going to these schools? And would that then crush the promise that those schools experience now because they have less accountability? Do you want, if ESAs really grow the way we're imagining, and all these Robert Pondiscio schools blow up,
Please not.
wouldn't we want someone to be looking to see if the Robert Pondiscio schools are good?
Until they're out of
I would
For
wager
example.
that Pondiscio Prep would be a good school. And I would probably also venture that Pondiscio Prep would be happy to be subject to some sort of, kind of accountability metric around academic performance, probably,
Probably, yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
and
Probably a
I'm
squish.
going to guess, Pondiscio Prep is going to be a core knowledge school, and I'd say core knowledge is maybe a close cousin of classical. It's kind of got a timeless model that isn't going to be buffeted by the sort of the fads that you alluded to, and is therefore probably going to be able to hold steady while being nimble and agile in terms of its modes of delivery, probably. So I'm sympathetic to some level of accountability around ESAs. Like I said, that makes me perhaps a heretic with some of the the sort of ESA crowd, but.
Corey DeAngelis is
We're going to go there. It's going to get
right
there.
now.
Yeah, he probably is.
I know we're up on it, but this is actually important. So there's what the advocates want, right? There's what the parents and providers want, and there's what states will do. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the range of policy among states that are passing ESAs, it's a lot like the range of policy among states that pass charter school laws, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe Arizona and West Virginia are one thing, but Tennessee, Georgia, and Louisiana were all like, well, it's not the state test, but there's a test, mm-hmm. right? So I think it's, the federalist system is delivering a take on ESA accountability and what role tests play in that. I would just, and I think it's great that governors are deciding it for us, which is cool. I would just also say that I'm wary of creating the same incentives we have in charter world in ESA world, mm-hmm. because then we get the same stuff we had, but with a different finance mechanism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good point.
It's a very good point. Okay, we're going to go over just a second because I just want to ask this one last exit question, brief answer if possible. I started out by talking about this brief shining moment of bipartisanship around charter schools, and then the Democrats went one way, the Republicans went another. Do any of you see a day in which there will be anything like bipartisan support for charter schools? Yes or no? And if the answer is no, does it matter? Do we need it? Do charters need it?
I would just say there is bipartisan support for charter schools. In red states and blue states, the kids of Democrats and Republicans like charter schools. And that over time will translate into a different political calculus around them. I think one of the worst things we can do is sort of seed the ground that they aren't or won't be again at the congressional level or state level at some point in the future. And I still think there's a lot of policy evidence, e.g. Arizona, mm-hmm. Colorado, Arkansas, Florida, whatever, and some of those states are mixed, whatever, to show that there's still legislative will to improve the condition of charter schools and to grow them for the families who want them. So I think this is going to shake itself out in the future. The political incentives at the moment are difficult, but the people have sort of spoken, right? I mean, they with one voice, right? No matter what state you're in, and I'm heartened by that.
Christy?
Well, I think Derrell says it well. I think that yes, it's bipartisan. I think it will continue. I think the unique arrangement, well, first of all, it probably doesn't need to be said, but Biden didn't cut the CSP because he favors ESAs, right? His wife is very close friends with the unions, and whether or not that played a role, they're still very scared of saying bad things about charter school. They want to say this is about, just right-sizing the program. Secretary Cardona in the appropriations hearing did not even want to use the word cut. So they're still they know there's a constituency out there, and they're not fully unleashing, with we love high quality charter schools. We're just trying to make sure they're accountable. So I mean, we're not to the point where we're just actually trying to kill you, where some members are like Rosa DeLauro.
And Helen, does Great Hearts concern itself with this?
I mean, we like to remain under the radar, and we've sort of, prospered for 22 years now, kind of out there in the desert, being largely left alone by a lot of this, sort of foment. I mean, we concern ourselves when we need to, but happily, in our home base of Arizona, the charter politics are somewhat different for reasons we've sort of alluded to, and we hope they stay that way. And you know, as also alluded to earlier, we're going to try to move to parts of the country where the policy environment is more welcoming rather than less. And oftentimes it's more welcoming rather than less because there is some sort of accord between, you know, left and right around charters being an important part of the schooling ecosystem. So I'm relatively optimistic. It's also made me a real federalist, you know, sort of observing all of this. I think, you know, the kind of laboratory of democracy means something when we're talking about, you know, charter policy, ESA policy, and so on. So I think there are, you know, good things happening in the charter world and bright days ahead. Yeah.
That is a good quasi-optimistic note on which to end. Please join me in thanking our guests.